Welcome to the Higher Ed Geek Podcast, where we explore the impact of EdTech on the student experience with engaging, fun, and relevant conversations that honor the wide range of work happening all across the higher ed ecosystem. I'm your host, Dustin Ramsdell. I've been working in and around higher ed for the past decade, focused on student support and digital experience. Join me every week for discussions with some of the best minds in education technology. We'll be bringing you their perspectives on how digital transformation is reshaping the way we recruit, engage, and graduate learners. You'll hear firsthand accounts of how institutional leaders are developing their strategy, as well as get deeper on the stories of how these EdTech tools are being built to foster better student outcomes. With that, let's get to today's episode.
Welcome back, everyone, for another special live episode of the Higher Ed Geek Podcast, recorded here at the DisruptED Summit, happening in Phoenix, Arizona, at the ASU campus, put on by Collegiate Education. Super excited for this conversation with a campus partner, institutional leader, Michael from St. John's University. If you wanted to briefly introduce yourself and your role at SJU.
Hi, great. Thank you for having me. My name is Michael Koskinen. I work as the Chief Online Learning Officer at St. John's University. So really, it is everything related to the support and growth of our online services and programs and academics for our students. It's a role that its job title is new. I've been there for about a year and a half. Worked for over 20 years in higher ed at different institutions. I reside in New Jersey, been at a numerous number of schools in the New Jersey area, so very familiar with kind of like that New York, New Jersey landscape of higher ed, which is always just a fun joy in many ways. So
yeah. I went to grad school at Rutgers in New Brunswick.
Rutgers. That's the monster of New Jersey. Everyone knows Rutgers.
Sure. Well, and that was sort of like it built my affinity for New Jersey. I grew up in Delaware and chastised or antagonized New Jerseyans and stuff. But it's a great place, great pizza, great breakfast sandwiches and diners. So
I haven't been to New Jersey, not bad, pretty good.
yeah. When I came, I was like, all right,
it's all right. Yeah.
It's always great to have folks like yourself, in like a CIO role, kind of your vantage point and your perspective on what's happening in your institution, kind of digital transformation. We'll ground our conversation a little bit more specifically in your all's online programs and sort of the journey there. So we'll start with kind of the context on sort of the journey so far with the online programs and that whole kind of experience at SJU.
So generally, I think it is as many schools as you probably see. There's schools announcing online initiatives left and right, the big players, obviously, and also some of the more smaller, whether public and regional and private, institutions that are trying to find ways to diverse revenue streams. And it's not too much different. I suggest at St. John's University, where the goal is really to be more competitive in the landscape within 50 miles of our campus. As I've told anyone who asks me, our desires, our goals aren't to become St. John's Global and compete with the bigger players in that space, but really to be part of that space within our local brand. And, St. John's has a very strong brand. A lot of people know us for the basketball and so forth, but we're also locally, we consider ourselves to be like, we advertise New York's college in some ways and has a very strong local name. And so based on that, still, it's a challenge for students who may want to come to campus. They don't want to be able to come. If you travel around New York City, it's tough to get to Queens. And so giving flexible opportunities to those students can really help us. And so we're trying to grow. And, roughly, depending on the numbers, about 5% of all of our students learn online at St. John's. In comparison to a lot of our peer schools, we want to be more in that 10 to 11 to 12% range. And that's really our goal, is to get there in the next 4 to 5 years. And so part of that is the growth of having a lot of more online degree options for our students. And so, it's as it is, it's very messy at many schools. It's very hard to get there. It's easier said than done. I can show you my wonderful slides. You'll be like, wow, that sounds amazing. But actually getting there, is certainly a lot of bumps in the road, and we'll have some successes. We'll have some failures along the way. But really, we're just trying to be competitive in a space where everyone is fighting for that. Every student, no matter where you are in the United States right now, looking under every rock to find students and enrollments, especially with the changes in the market and the number of issues that are ongoing in higher ed, which there's probably list off about a dozen of them right now. So
Yeah. I mean, it's that's part of, convenings like this. It's, folks kind of being in community, talking through those things, the challenges, the struggles, the successes and everything. And I think it is, to your all's credit, your team, committing to this work where it is a big culture shift where, any institution across the country has existed a certain way for, oftentimes maybe like hundreds of years, and now kind of making a big shift into kind of a new format and kind of the whole sort of digital environment and experience for the students and, how faculty and staff sort of work with them. So I think it is, it's messy work and stuff like you said, but it's important work, I think, for a lot of institutions to be thinking about their kind of digital education strategy, how they want to show up, in that space. And then how do you make sure that those students are getting, a good experience, getting the credentials, and the experiences that they are looking for and everything. So, and yeah, I mean, there's a lot of approaches. Certainly some big players have gone just kind of, committed resources and kind of building out their experience themselves. Others have worked at OPMs and, different fashions and all that. So I'm curious in your perspective, again, from your vantage point, I'm sure sort of like, obviously your own experience at your institution, experiences at like, peer institutions or other places maybe that you've been. But what is your perspective on how like dynamics with OPMs have changed over the years? Again, just sort of blending together your own experience and what you kind of understood from, your colleagues and peers and that sort of thing.
I would say I was talking to someone about this yesterday about the OPM market, and I'm sure you'll get different perspectives depending on who you speak to. But I've actually worked over the years at 3 different institutions with OPMs, and I've always also been part of the ending of the OPMs. And, it's funny, what generally happens is, especially with the rev share models, which were very popular about, 10 years to a couple of years ago, a lot of schools were signing up because, the OPMs would come in and there's little risk on the institution's part. Senior leadership this is great. They'll sign the agreement. And then leadership turns over. And that's when everything, at least in my perspective, it always kind of goes a different way. Mm-hmm. And then the new leadership comes in and they kind of question, what is this? They then have, at this point, the institution is then paying all of the resources that were given up front. And so senior leaders would typically go, I don't like this at all. And then also, too, a lot of times the relationships don't work out because the institution may see the students, but they're not as dedicated as they should be. And then they put a lot of heat on the OPM, but the OPM is also kind of not thrilled about the institution because their commitment is kind of wishy-washy. They want the students, but the culture is not there. And so a lot of times they kind of go through these long contracts and sometimes they're not really happy with it. And I'm sure there's many examples of where it's been very successful. Yeah. So, but I think you have to make sure if you're going to get into the rev share model, you have an institution that is ready to embrace it for a long time and not just for the period in which the person who signed the agreement is going to be there. And so that becomes a huge challenge. And, I think that's why a lot of schools are more interested or at least moving towards, especially with a lot of the stress on the market, more fee for service kind of arrangements and try to go in that aspect of that. Everyone that I've been at. And then the challenges when you leave that also become a problem too, because it's like, well, how do you sustain that resource that was given to you? And a lot of that resources comes down to the marketing of the programs, which I think a lot of schools don't do a great job of. And so how do we keep that sort of strategic enrollment marketing going that has a large financial dollar amount when schools don't have a lot of resources to support that? Yeah.
And we're going to stick with this for a little bit because I think it is one of those things of often, if something's too good to be true, it often is. That idea, I think, like the promise, the potential, the idea, this that, no risk on the institution side. The OPM comes in, they just, do everything for you and it's just like everybody wins or whatever else. It's like always going to be a little bit more complicated than that, or just like nuances, certainly as time goes on, leadership changes or whatever else. And because I think it's an idea of like, oh yeah, just sign on the dotted line. And it's just, we've all got dollar signs in our eyes. It's just going to be kind of a gravy train from here on out. And I think it's, part of it where it's just gotten more and more competitive, more, institutions are getting in and whatever else. But it's just a different world, certainly, where like there was, I think, a lot of benefit for OPMs, as many people probably knew them, being these kind of initial drivers of like, digital education can exist, high quality, engaging, and with, big, kind of institutional brands getting into the fray, I think kind of gave maybe more permission for others and stuff. But I think now there is much more where there's sort of, blended approaches or like fee for, like there's all these sort of different things that have kind of like, I think been the sort of maturation of the model of, that idea of, you can bring in a partner to work with you in whatever way you need for however long that you need them to, or whatever else. So with that, you kind of, I think we're extrapolating or explaining sort of like a little bit of the history of the past and the sort of dynamics that sort of like, that ownership piece, or, whether a lack of it, or, kind of being left with the bag at a certain point, like on the institutional side or whatever. How do you see like the blended approach and like fee for service and that sort of thing serving like you, or just like, serving you all kind of moving forward? Like, what are the benefits of that for an institution like yours or others?
Well, the benefit is that if it sucks, we can move on from it very quickly.
Yeah.
Right. It allowed to us to pivot. I like to be able to have a lot of different relationships with different partners as well, because it's important to not have all my eggs in one basket. So it allows a lot of flexibility. The challenge is being able to pay for all of it, because it's expensive up front to do those sorts of things. And it's also try to build something long term, because if one thing doesn't work, I can pivot from it. I can change. We can be more agile. It becomes very challenging to be able to manage all of those relationships, or who are doing it, because our instructional design services, we kind of work on contract with some outsourcing. We work with collegiate education on some of our branding aspects of that, and paid marketing is someplace else right now. So being able to manage all those relationships kind of becomes a challenge, but at the same time, it allows for that sort of flexibility. I kind of equate it more towards, if you go to the restaurant, and New Jersey's famous for diners, and I get a diner menu, and there's all of these choices on the menu, and it becomes a challenge to be able to maintain all that, when maybe if you get like the nice fancy restaurant, you get a selection that's already kind of prefixed, and you're like, okay, I'm going to eat this. So it's kind of, that makes it a little more difficult, but at the same time, it gives more choice to me. So
yeah, that's a good. I love a good metaphor, and I think that's an apt one.
I like food a lot too. So it's
well, because it's like because like a Cheesecake Factory or whatever sort of has that same problem of like, it's just this huge tome, and it's like you probably can't do all these things like
but what do you do well? Yeah, that's also true too.
I think that could be part of it. Yeah, is knowing that like, okay, I think you're spreading yourself a little too thin as this potential partner for us as an institution. Like, we'd like somebody that kind of maybe can make a clear case for like a specialization of certain thing, where it's like, oh yeah, that is really kind of what we need specifically, versus kind of being, overwhelmed and then underwhelmed because you're just getting something that, a partnership that just doesn't work out in the end. But I think, that right balance, and I think the sort of flexibility, maybe on demand kind of, contracts or partnerships to like serve your needs in the moment, but then trying to at least know, partners that, you'd like to work with that you may return to. And I think one quick follow-up that I'll put to you is, I think the other benefit of this sort of like blended approach, the flexibility and all that, is like, I do think it sort of forces the point of having much clearer goals and terms and timeline, because I think that was something else of like kind of, the OPM partnerships and rev share partnerships of yore, is that like they were signing these like super long-term contracts and whatever else. It's like, yeah, that's great. Yeah, you'd want to have like a partner committed for the long haul and all that. But I think I would worry in that instance that there is like, this sort of lack of urgency or anything. That idea of like, well, we're partnered for 30 years. Like, well, it'll all shake out well in the end, we promise. Versus it being like, we can pay you this much. We need this done by this time. And this is specifically like our goals and outcomes. I'm curious just your sort of perspective of like this moment in time now. Like, honestly, like institutional leaders may be a little bit more empowered to kind of really set the terms, set the goals, set the sort of timeline, and be really clear and specific with what they need. Is that something that you've kind of seen or experienced?
I mean, I think it's important as to not the long-term agreements. The only long-term contract I think I should sign these days is my mortgage. Other than that, I don't like anything above 3 years. How can you predict what your institution is going to look like 4 or 5 years from now? No one could predict where we are today with the number of concerns that are ongoing. There are some things that obviously you could see coming, but to forecast, like our strategy, we're predicting up like where our goal is by fall of 29. As I've told anyone who asks, like we have to make, there's going to be changes. I can't foresee the changes that will come both politically, from legalities, from technology, from artificial intelligence, like from the market, where we're actually stand as an institution. So I think part of that too is that we have to make those sorts of changes in the moment. Not to get on my high horse, but my higher ed view is that we should kind of I'm more of the blow it up kind of approach. And because there's a lot of things that we should be changing in higher ed. And traditionally, many schools are very slow to make those changes because of the nature of the beast through the primary institution, through shared governance, through, the way programs are reviewed and the academics and the way we sort our students through. But we have to be able to move right now and not have something that takes 4 years before us to even get it off the ground. So I know that's kind of diverging a little bit, but I think we should be moving quickly as fast as possible right at this very time rather than, a few years down the line to try to get there. And then by the time that things have changed already. So.
No, yeah, and I think that gets to where my sort of mind was going, because that sort of empowerment piece or whatever, you being very cognizant of all those sort of different variables and knowing maybe, you need to deliver, and provide value quickly versus it being, way more kind of delayed, or that idea would be well, yeah, we can really only kind of chart a course up to this point, and, we may be happily, renewing at that point, but we just need to be very aware of adjustments that might need to be made, after 2 years versus signing something for 4 years and you're kind of locked in, and it's going to be a lot harder to kind of navigate things. So I think there's, to me, a great opportunity, hopefully, for institutional leaders to feel that sort of empowerment of knowing that, if you need support in a certain area, I think anymore, my hope would be that you can really sort of set the terms, in terms of the length, the nature of a partnership to kind of bring in that blended approach. And it could be where it's you keep renewing, on shorter terms, or if it's just sort of hey, it was great to work with you on this sort of, marketing piece. We're good for now, and we'll absolutely come back if we need more support with something else. But, because, there are just so many dynamics, and I think, looking back again, that idea, if you're locked into something super long term with an OPM or whatever else, it does just limit your ability even further, at an organization of a college university where it's it's already sort of predisposed to be not as nimble as it could or should be, for, the number of reasons that you can outline there. But, so I think that's a great piece. And I think it perfectly sets up, if you want to kind of synthesize, or kind of expand on, what you're speaking to there of our final question that we'll kind of go through in all of our interviews here, advice for other leaders navigating this moment, maybe other CIOs at other institutions, advice that you would give for others leading and navigating this moment.
I think that we should be looking at, it's easy. I can give a whole bunch of fluff answers we should be thinking about our students. And that's very important, because I think that gets kind of lost in what we're trying to do. Is what do our students want us to do? And especially when there's a question of the value of our degrees that we're giving, the cost, what are the career outcomes, the things that anyone who's been working in higher ed has heard over the years. But I would think we have to really think about what is the student success, what is their need, and what do they want from us? And when we're thinking about the programs that we're delivering, we should be doing it in a way that allows them to have that sort of flexibility. I get kind of concerned about the traditional 4-year model of a bachelor's degree. There are many places and schools where it works very well. I was here at Arizona State University. I was walking around. It's obviously a destination school. Students come for the experience, for the student life. They want to earn their degree while they're here, have a great experience, mature as an individual, and then go out into the workforce. But a lot of, other schools that maybe aren't destination schools can't maybe offer that same experience. So for those smaller schools, how do you provide that value proposition that wants someone to come here, get that experience, and then when they're done, they're able to have an opportunity to get that degree? And right now, I think a 4-year experience in some ways could be too long. And also the traditional model of sitting in a room and listening to someone talk and lecture for you for 2 hours, 45 minutes, or whatever the designated class time, that's not how people operate today. I don't really recognize that model is really kind of growing more extinct. And so as students, in the workplace, people work hybrid, they work remotely, they don't maybe come to the physical space as much, or there's a lot more, at least a lot more flexibility in terms of their lives. So why do we designate our courses to be for this period of time? It's based on really an old kind of system that we were built on. And so how does the higher ed university transform from there? And some schools are going to do a great job. They'll have some very creative ideas. And other schools, they're going to struggle. And we've seen a lot of that in the marketplace, schools that are either closing or merging or trying to find other ways to find enrollments. And I'm not necessarily suggesting that anything that I'm trying is going to be a huge success or anything that our school, I hope that's the case. We're thinking about that, but it's really hard to steer a ship that's been going one direction for so long. And you also have to stay true, I think, to any leader into the mission of your school too, because it's very easy for you to kind of look, okay, we want to get this, but is this in tune with our school's mission of what we're trying to accomplish? Because I think we've kind of foreseen it, because even though we're all in higher ed, we're all thinking of it a little bit differently, and we have to stay true to that too. And so they're balancing a huge juggling act of getting there. And I think thinking very articulately about that. And also, like we were just talking about before, you kind of have to try some new things relatively quickly. And so that's really the problem. And I think that's what every question when we're at events like this that people are always asking. And it's a lot easier to ask it, but coming up with the answer is really tricky.
Yeah, I think that's a great sentiment, because I think that idea of the student needs, preferences, your mission or kind of differentiators being the sort of North Star that can guide you as you're making these decisions, where there's sort of this, opportunity. I would assume, kind of culturally, when an institution is embarking on kind of expanding their digital education programs, whether they're, working with OPMs or not, or whatever, but that idea of you can, help, make sure that you're keeping those decisions grounded and you don't sort of undermine or sort of veer too far as you're going into that. Because I think that is sort of the key, is not sort of trying to just emulate some other institution that's out there to become, SGU global or whatever. That's sort of a fool's errand, versus it being we know what we do. We know what we do well. Let's try to position that and offer it, and, find kind of opportunities to, engage more students in more different ways. And I don't know, I guess my hope would be that it creates this sort of, kind of opportunity for those conversations to, rethink things, but keep it grounded in sort of the mission and the, student needs, preferences, and sort of, the experience that they're getting, that they're looking for, and that they value from, a particular institution, versus everything eventually just becoming vanilla milquetoast duplicates of each other or whatever. So that would be not great.
We have to be okay with, to your point, we have to be okay with failing a little bit too, because, there's a lot of things that were a little very risk averse of higher ed in general, and a lot of trying things. And, so much has changed too. And, I don't remember, maybe about 10, 15 years ago, when everyone was panicking about MOOCs in higher ed.
Right.
Oh my goodness, it's going to change the whole system. Not really. Some interesting things came out of it, but not particularly. And so now today we're all kind of oh my goodness, AI and so forth. I used to teach, instructional technology to upcoming K through 12 teachers. And I would always showcase the history in some ways of educational technology. And through every phase of education, there was always something that was very disruptive that people would kind of panic about. I played a clip from, I think, the 50s of television, of educational television. It's we won't have teachers anymore. You're all going to be taught by this TV. And it sounds so funny when I still laugh when I remember that video. And the students would always chuckle, and I would always kind of make, but it doesn't mean it's not going to be disruptive and things will change, but there's always this extreme level. So, obviously AI is totally different than television, but how we able to integrate this and think about this is really important, and how we can enhance the educational model. We're not replacing teachers, but there's going to be something that's going to change. And so we have to make sure we adapt to that. And we're relatively very slow. Some schools kind of go all in on these sorts of changes really fast, and some of them, and like I said, it's okay to fail in those tests, but at least we're trying. And so I'm always very curious about this, especially for students. There's a nice expression, technology is anything after you were born. So these things just exist. No one's like, I think of like the air conditioner is tremendous technology, but we don't really think of it like that because it was already here when I was born.
Right.
So how do we actually get those students to actually understand and integrate that is really important for us moving forward. So
yeah. I mean, I think there's what I'm kind of getting from what you're saying of like that balance of disruption, but sort of embracing sort of the fundamentals of the foundation that sort of, makes you an institution that has existed for a while, been successful, what people think of you, and sort of the awareness of who you are. I don't know. So yeah, just like a lot of interesting things to think about and consider, and just sort of this era of digital transformation, AI, online programs, and how institutions sort of interact and partner with OPMs and other sort of external partners and stuff. So just appreciate you, Michael, for hanging out, sharing all that you did, and again, thank you to Collegiate and ASU for hosting us and housing us here for this conversation and this event. So thank you
very much. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Higher Ed Geek podcast. This show is a proud member of the Enrollify Network, home to Higher Ed's largest collection of podcasts. Enrollify is where higher ed goes to grow. So be sure to check out our other podcasts, webinars, video clips, blogs, and more. Visit Enrollify.org and subscribe for all the latest details and content drops directly to your inbox. Enrollify is brought to you by Element 451, the digital workforce platform for higher ed. Learn more at element451.com.